the Juneau World Affairs Council presents Current Relations with Cuba with Charles Shapiro. Shapiro has decades of experience in the Foreign Service with various posts across the Caribbean and South America, including as U.S. Ambassador to Venezuela.
Good evening, or to make it better, good evening, y'all. It's a pleasure to be here in Juneau, and I'm delighted to have such a big audience here. I'm Charles Shapiro. I'm the President of the World Affairs Council of Atlanta, and I've got to tell you how proud I was yesterday when President Obama nominated Jeff De Laurentiis to be the U.S. Ambassador to Cuba. He's an old friend of mine, somebody I've worked with off and on over the years, and there is no one more qualified to be the U.S. Ambassador in Cuba than Jeff De Laurentiis, who, by the way, is already there working as the Charge d'Affaires without the title of Ambassador. So how did we get there, right? I mean, all of you remember the difficult years we've had in our relationship with Cuba, so how did we get there? And that's what I want to talk about tonight. And I hope you'll recognize here on the opening slide there that building in the middle that looks like the U.S. Capitol is actually the Cuban Capitol, which was modeled on the U.S. Capitol, except as every Cuban will tell you, I mean, literally every Cuban will tell you it's 6 feet taller than the U.S. Capitol, right? Okay. That's Jose Marti on the right, who's the father of Cuban independence, and on the left, obviously, y'all recognize the Cuban flag. And if I can make this advance, here we go. So first, I want to do some comparisons of Cuba and just in size so that you've got an idea what it is. The economy of Cuba, the total GDP of Cuba, is equivalent to the GDP of metropolitan Hartford, Connecticut. Okay? I had an intern looking yesterday to find an equivalent in Alaska, and she couldn't find economy by municipality in Alaska, unfortunately. But we need to keep that in mind, because there are so many U.S. business people who are just convinced that they are going to go to Havana and make a killing and just pick up $100 bills off the ground. It is 11 million people in what is in fact a very poor country. It's got a GDP of $81 billion, and here you see the comparison. It's essentially the same population as the Dominican Republic with an economy half the size of the Dominican Republic. So you've got 11 million people who are well-educated, nice, friendly people who are very poor. The Cuban economy is stuck, and that's the thing we need to keep in mind. It's stuck for two reasons. One is U.S. embargo. In 1962, the U.S. imposed an economic embargo on Cuba, which made it illegal for U.S. business to trade with Cuba, to import or export to Cuba. It's changed over the years. It got turned into law in 1996, and in fact it is law now, and the president does not have the authority to remove the embargo. It has to be removed by Congress. And if you think about it, here's a country of 11 million people right next to the United States with 320 million people. We're the natural market for Cuban exports. We're the natural market for Cuba, for tourists going to Cuba. It's like Canada and the U.S. I mean, we are neighbors. And so that U.S. embargo has hurt the Cuban economy. But I'm going to argue that there's an even worse embargo on Cuba, and that is Cuba's embargo on itself. And that embargo is called communism. It's called an economic system that just flat out does not work. Hadn't worked anywhere else, and it works equally well in Cuba. It just flat out doesn't work. And it doesn't work for Cubans, and it doesn't work for foreigners, non-U.S. foreigners attempting to do business in Cuba. So there's very little foreign investment in Cuba from Brazil, from China, from Europe. So it's not just that Cuba is poor because the U.S. isn't investing in Cuba, it's that nobody's investing in Cuba. And what the Cubans don't understand is that if you can make more money investing in Vancouver than you can in Havana, you're going to invest in Vancouver. That's just the way life works. It's the way business works. And finally, you need to keep in mind that it really is, in many ways, both for good and for ill. It's 1959 in Havana still. This is a photo of Havana Harbor. That big black cloud that you see coming out is from the generating plant, because they're still generating electricity using a pre-1959 electric plant that is burning fuel oil to generate electricity and turning out a huge cloud of black smoke over the city. The same is true with the oil refinery. It's the old Gulf Oil Refinery in Havana, which now is run by the Cuban state-owned company that is refining oil and doing the same thing, of course. It's got cutting-edge 1959 technology. In April, the 5th Congress of the Cuban Communist Party met. Now, unless you're a policy wonk and you follow communist countries, you don't understand how important the party congresses are, whether it's in China or it's in Cuba or in Vietnam. I mean, they are huge events. There was great expectation. This was after President Obama's visit, right? And there was great expectation that the country was moving in the right direction, that the economy was going to open up further. And in fact, what came out of the Cuban Party Congress in April was zero. Very little change. It was just, we're going to stay the course. We're going to keep doing what we're doing. We're going to reform Cuba. We're going to reform the economy, but we're going to do it in our pace, on our time. And that means very, very slowly. And so here's what I think are the people who are the future of Cuba. And that's what they call the CUENTAPROPISTAS. And it is a Spanish word which doesn't exist anywhere except in Cuba. Cuentapropista is somebody who's working on their own account, self-employed. They can't call them private sector. They can't call themselves business people because it goes against their own self-concept of what Cuba is about. And so they're people who are allowed to work on their own account. Starting in 1966, if I'm not mistaken, the government of Cuba actually abolished the private sector. So there was no private sector. I mean, if you were a beauty parlor operator, you became a state employee. If you were a shoe shine guy, you became a state employee. So starting in the 90s, they started to open the economy more and to allow some essentially personal services to go into business for themselves, but very, very gradually. It has expanded, but there are literally 203 job categories that you can do in Cuba without getting a special permission from the government of Cuba. Now, I'm going to bet that within a mile of where we are sitting right now, there's probably 1,000, 5,000 different job categories. And if you count secretary as one, lawyer as one, doctor as another, shoe shine guy, restaurant operator, okay, all that. If you add all that together, and so you can see I'm going to show you some of the people who are working on their own, who've started their own businesses with really the deck stacked against them. Okay, they can't incorporate, they can't import, they can't export. Most of them can't get loans. There's no commercial law. If they have a dispute, there's no court to solve a dispute between a supplier and the person who's buying the supply. This gentleman here, if you go to Havana, you got to meet with him. His name is Julio Alvarez. He restores those beautiful old cars from the 1950s. By the way, he only does General Motors cars. His dad was a General. If some of you are old enough, like I am, to remember that you were either a Ford family or you were a General Motors family. He came from a General Motors family and only worked on General Motors cars. And way in the background, over the convertible, is a Craftsman metal lathe that that was his father's. And you remember how they were guaranteed for life, Craftsman tools? Well, this one is still operating and he's still using it restoring cars. The woman on the left has a factory making baby clothes. She's got 3 sewing machines. She's got 4 employees, 2 operating sewing machines, 2 operating in a store that she has. I mean, that's her factory. And you can see there's 2 sewing machines there. The one on the right is a pedal-operated sewing machine that they have jury-rigged an electric motor to. Right, so they've hooked it up to the fan belt. The woman on the right actually is the wife of the guy who's restoring the cars. He restores the cars. She runs the business. And that's her favorite car, whose name is Lola. This young man here is an app developer. I'm going to run through these very quickly. There are people who give lectures for tourists who come down and want to know what's going on, and there are people who will talk about in this case, the guy on the right is an economist, the guy on the left is a retired diplomat. They're entertainers. The guy on the right is half of Cuba's leading hip-hop band. I probably didn't think there was rap music in Cuba, but in fact there is, called Obsession. There are services. The gentleman on the left, the bald guy, runs a beauty parlor, a barber shop. The 2 women on the right, the one in the black top runs a restaurant, actually runs it really well, a restaurant you should go to when you're there. The woman on the left in the turquoise top is a former professor of economics at the University of Havana who now is an event planner. I don't know the size of the Hispanic population of Alaska, but if you know what a quinceañera is, you got to have a quinceañera. So she plans quinceañeras, she plans weddings, she plans if relatives from abroad are coming. Her supply chain, and this is the same for almost all these people here, her supply chain is to fly to Miami every month to 6 weeks with an empty suitcase, go to the party store, fill up the suitcase, and go back to Cuba. Okay, she has to pay import duty. I mean, she pays taxes on it. It's legal, but clearly it's an inefficient supply chain. These are artists. The man paints. His wife is a sculptor. This is a gallery on the right. Farmers, tobacco. Obviously, Cuban cigars are famous. The farmer on the right is expanding. He's putting up another tobacco barn to dry the tobacco. He said, I'm right on the road and the tourists are coming. This is great. He's making money. But here's what I want y'all to look at is that the United States exports to Cuba $300 million a year. Okay, so I've got some comparisons there. $7.2 billion to the Dominican Republic, $116 billion to China, $354 billion to Canada, $236 billion to Mexico. The U.S. exports to Canada every 9, I'm saying this backwards. Every 9 minutes we export to Canada what we export to Cuba in a year. Okay? Every 9 minutes. So, Cuba is fascinating. Let me tell you why. Is that they understand that that the economy doesn't work. The president of the country, Raul Castro, says the economy doesn't work, and they're trying to figure out how to make it work without giving up what they consider to be the benefits of the revolution. And so they want to maintain central planning. They want to maintain government control. They want to continue. Education in Cuba is free to the student. Obviously, there's tests to get into university or to get into medical school. But once you're in, it's free. Healthcare is free in Cuba for the patients. I mean, all healthcare, from primary to, they have centers that focus on particular problems, cardiac centers, cancer centers, in both regionally, and then they have a national center in Havana. It's all free. But if you think about it, it is hugely, hugely expensive. And so what they're trying to figure out how to do is to maintain a centrally planned economy that really is terribly inefficient and doesn't work well, while at the same time keeping health care free to the patient and education free to the student. And that's what they're looking at right now. And that makes it a great time to go to Cuba. I mean, it is a fascinating place. It's a beautiful country. People are well educated. But the best analogy that I can come up with is that it reminds me when I was 10 years old and went to the swimming pool with my brother, and he made me go up on the high dive. And he said, you have to jump off. And if you don't jump off, I'm going to beat you up. And you go to the edge of the high dive, right, and you look down, and you think you're going to get killed if you jump. And that's where Cuba is right now. They're at the high dive, and they can't figure out if they want to jump by opening their economy or if they want to come back down the ladder. And that's what they're facing. So that's what they're up to. I invite you to come to Cuba with us. I'm taking 2 trips to Cuba this year in February, and then in April. We're going to Colombia in March, and we're going to Ireland in March. So I invite y'all to come with us. It's the World Affairs Council of Atlanta. I'm going on the Cuba and Colombia trips. A colleague of mine, a professor from Georgia State University, is leading the trip to Ireland. And now I'd like to answer questions from you about anything you would like to know about Cuba, about U.S. and Cuba, about where our relations are going, about Venezuela and Cuba, and about Venezuela and the United States. So thank you very much. There's a microphone here. And if you can speak in the mic, that's great, so it gets on the video. Yes, sir.
Thank you for that introduction to Cuba. Could you elaborate a little bit on what Cuba has as exports? I understand they export medical professionals to other Central and South American countries, particularly Venezuela. Could you expand on that?
Yeah, Cuba's it's a great question, what Cuba's exports are. Their number one export is tourism. Okay, if you're an economist, you realize that foreign tourism is an export. Okay, a German tourist comes to Alaska, goes to a restaurant, orders a meal, that meal becomes an export, right? You go to the same restaurant, it's not an export. So their number one export is tourism. Their second source of foreign currency are remittances. And that is Cubans abroad sending money to family members back in Cuba. And by the way, that's very important in the economies of most developing countries, from India to Mexico. I mean, that's just the way it works. If your citizens are working abroad, they send money home. They export medical professionals, as you said. I mean, and it's the whole range of medical professionals. It's not just doctors, it's doctors, nurses, lab techs, dentists, but also ballet instructors, dance instructors, basketball coaches. The doctors go, a lot of them are going to Brazil, they're going to Haiti, they're going to countries in Africa where the governments actually pay them for that. Haiti's an exception. Haiti, they're not making any money on it, okay? But in most countries they're doing it and they're making a profit. They pay the doctors more than they would make if they were working in Cuba, but less than what the state is getting paid for the doctor. The doctors get a stipend while they're abroad. The money gets deposited in an account in Havana. The idea is how do you encourage them to come home? And their spouse can't go with them. Okay. Other exports, I mean, what they're hopeful for is biotech. I mean, Cuba has, for the size of the country, a very robust biotech industry, and they've got some medicines that, actually some are being tested in the United States right now that look like they could be promising, but we all know how hard it is to get a medicine tested and to see that it really is, that it does what it is supposed to be doing, right? That it withstands that sort of testing and is safe to use. They also, obviously, they export cigars, they export nickel. The cigars, while they're famous, are in fact, in economic terms, not that significant in terms of their entire economy. The other side of the question is, what is it they import? And the answer is everything. Cuba imports 60% of the food that is consumed in Cuba. The $300 million they buy from the U.S. is food. Since 2001, if I'm not mistaken, the United States removed food and medical supplies from the embargo. Cubans weren't interested in buying medical supplies, but they were interested in buying food. And so they buy food from the United States and from other countries as well. But everything else, all kinds of machinery, computers, all kinds of equipment, high-tech stuff is almost all imported. And that's what they're doing.
Thank you.
And I'm sorry, the other export is Cubans are moving abroad pretty quickly, so that the population of Cuba is dropping. While lifespan is expanding. So that they're facing what a number of countries, they're not the only country facing this. Japan is in the worst circumstance, where the number of workers per retiree is dropping. And so to maintain the retirement benefits is harder and harder in Cuba. And the people who are leaving are young people.
And I imagine they don't have an immigration.
That would be zero. Yeah, there's almost nobody immigrating to Cuba. Cubans are immigrating from Cuba to Spain, to Latin America, and of course to the United States. Yes. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you so much for coming. Things are sounding pretty dire in Venezuela, pretty dangerous, pretty impoverished. Can you give us an update of that country really briefly?
It's, dire is exactly the right word for Venezuela. Venezuela has, since Hugo Chavez was elected president, and he was elected in '98, became president in January of '99. They followed an extreme populist economic policy based on oil. And that worked well as long as oil prices were increasing. When Hugo Chavez became president of Venezuela, oil was at $8 a barrel. When he died, it was at $114 a barrel. You may have some experience with this in Alaska as well, right? Economists say that the Venezuelan budget, just the federal government spending, to meet their spending obligations, they would need oil to be at $150 a barrel. I don't know what it is today. It's somewhere around 40 for WTI. Venezuelan oil is very heavy. It's expensive to refine, and so they get less than what you see as the benchmark that's in the newspaper, and so they're probably getting somewhere in the mid-30s right now for their oil. Okay, those are all the statistics, but the reality means that they don't have the money to pay for their imports. Their economic system is based on oil, and oil prices are down. Their political system is based on one party running everything. The opposition has won a majority in the National Assembly. The government has used the Supreme Court essentially to say, take power away from the National Assembly. There's an effort to have a recall referendum, which their Constitution envisions, the Constitution written by Hugo Chavez. I won't get into the details, but I can if you really want to know. But essentially what they have determined is that you can collect the signatures to activate the recall referendum only in mid-October, which means the recall referendum wouldn't be held until 2017, which means that if President Nicolas Maduro is recalled, that the vice president then would become the president. If he had been revoked in 2016, there would have been a new presidential election. And from my perspective, what I see is the government sealing off all possibilities, all the escape valves for the political pressure that's building up in Venezuela. Because I'm sure you've seen on the news, there's no food. They import all their food, they don't have the money to import it, and so the shelves are empty in the stores. You've got riots at stores, you've got police outside the stores, you've got trucks being stopped and looted for the food. There was a picture, a photo that I saw 2 days ago with at a nursery, a newborn unit in a hospital, with 6 babies literally in cardboard boxes because they just did not have the cribs for the babies. I mean, the system is collapsing, and Caracas now has the highest homicide rate in the world. I think his crime is completely out of control. So that's what's going on. And how they work their way out of it is going to be extremely difficult because the government refuses to negotiate with the opposition and refuses to change its policies. So they're in a fix. Yes. Yes, sir.
A couple questions here. How sustainable is a communist regime beyond the Castros? That would be a first question. A second question is a corollary to that is the regime generally supported by the population?
Those are both two great questions. The first question is will communism survive the death of the 2 Castro brothers, right? The younger brother, Raul, is 84. The older brother, Fidel, I think he's 87. I may be wrong, maybe it's 88. Fidel was and still is a popular national figure in Cuba. Raul, less so because he's not the kind of public figure that Fidel is. I mean, doesn't have the charisma. And that's both good and bad. Will it survive is the question that nobody knows the answer to. And part of that is that decision-making inside Cuba is a black box inside a black box. Nobody knows how it works. The government controls the police, the military, the intelligence service. So, how bad can things get and the government continue? And I don't know the answer to that. I don't know the answer to that in Venezuela. I don't know the answer to that in North Korea. Things can get really bad and the government can stay in control under very difficult circumstances. Cubans are very proud people. I mean, they're very proud of their country. And the people who are my age are proud of the revolution and what the revolution has brought. For them, they've seen real improvements in their lives, and particularly people who were poor before the revolution. Their children and their grandchildren, less so. And so that's who you see leaving. I'll give you an example. The woman who runs the event planning business went to what I guess we would call a magnet school in the U.S. I mean, it's a school that you have to take a test to get into that all the best students go to. It's the Vladimir Lenin High School in Havana. And the kids who graduate from that school are the kids who typically go on to be the staff assistant they all go to university. They then become the assistant to a minister. They move up in the ranks, whether it's in the military or the civilian ministries. So I asked her how many students she's in her 34, 35, early to mid 30s, how many students from her class have left the country? And she said 70%. Okay, so those are the elite of the elite, right? The smartest, best, most benefited students in the country. And that if 70% of the people from her graduating class have left the country, you gotta wonder. And that's what Americans, we like to think we're so pragmatic. If you were running the country, if you were running Cuba, you would look at that and you go, my gosh, if our young people are leaving, we've got to do something to change this system. And that, I think they know they have to change it, but they are hesitant to do so. I can't remember what your second question was, because I gave you such a long answer to the first one.
I think it was that does the population generally support the regime?
Well, the problem is there's no polling data. Nobody knows. Nobody knows. So if you talk to Cubans who've left Cuba, they say no. If you talk to Cubans inside Cuba, oh, well, yeah, The thing that, I've been going to Cuba since 1998, and I've been 6 times in the past year and a half. And a couple of interesting things have happened over that amount of time, is that it's not surprising anymore to have people be open, talking. They have no idea who I am, right? And I speak Spanish, so you start talking to people in the craft market, when you bump into people. And people are openly critical of the government, which they were not before. I think they were afraid to be. Now they're not afraid to criticize the government, to say, "Hi, can you help me get out of the country? I want to leave Cuba." And so that's changed. The other thing that's changed, and I think it's to the credit of the government, is there's Wi-Fi in Cuba. There's Wi-Fi in the parks. They have Wi-Fi hotspots all around the country, mainly in public parks. You can buy it's like remember when you had to use the cards for your cell phone, and you would dial, and it gave you so many minutes. The cards give you 2 hours of Wi-Fi. I'm going to change again. It's an hour of Wi-Fi for $2, okay? Average wage in Cuba is $23 a month, so it's expensive. But 2 years ago, that same card was $6 for an hour of Wi-Fi, and now it's down to $2. And the number of parks that have the Wi-Fi have increased. And everywhere you go in Havana where they have these hotspots, you see mainly, but not only, young people out there on their phones. And you see them Skyping with their relatives who are in Madrid or in Miami. And that's really, really changed. And everybody that I talk to says that and I can tell you because I go on the same Wi-Fi system, and the websites that you can visit, as far as I can tell, are not restricted. Okay, so you can go to the New York Times, you can go to Facebook, can't use Facebook in China, by the way. You can go to Twitter, can't use Twitter in China. But more importantly is, you can read the Nuevo Herald, the Miami Herald in Spanish. You can read El País, the most important Spanish language newspaper in the world that's from Madrid. You can go online and read all that without any restrictions. And that's a huge change. And it's an important change because it means that more Cubans have a better idea of what's going on outside of Cuba. In 1998, when I first went to Cuba, if all you know is this reality, it's very hard to judge that reality. But if you can see what's going on in the world, then you get a different idea. You get a different idea. I was in Cuba in December of 2014, and they get on Cuban TV, they pick up, there's essentially a Venezuelan state-run equivalent of CNN. I think there's 2 or 3 channels in Cuba on Cuban TV. And one of them is almost entirely Telesur, this Venezuelan channel. And they showed Nicolas Maduro live. I'm watching it live from my hotel in Havana saying, we just got beat in this assembly election. And I don't like it, and we're going to have to, and he was saying all the right stuff from Venezuela. For Cubans, the idea that there's an election with more than one candidate, that the opposition could win. As funny as it sounds, watching Venezuelan TV is actually eye-opening in Cuba. So Cuba is opening more to the world. I give you a long roundabout answer. I apologize for that. More questions? Jim.
Just 2. What has the opening of Cuba done for the image of the United States inside Cuba? And secondly, what has the opening of Cuba done for the image of the United States throughout the rest of Latin America?
Those are two good questions. The Cuban government has always said it doesn't have any problem with the people of the United States, that's a problem with the government of the United States and U.S. policy. Even back in the 90s, I mean, I'd bump into people and they would talk about, you know, gosh, I love NBA, you know, love U.S. baseball. Or, do you know my cousin who lives in Chicago? I mean, people ask you that. You must get that. You know, so-and-so who lives in Alaska when you're in Hawaii. Anyhow, so the image of the United States, I think, is always at the level of the street has been relatively positive. It certainly is very, very positive now. And I'm going to go on a bit of a tangent, is the same way that U.S. business people thought there was going to be this huge bonanza in Cuba, I think Cubans thought that once we normalized relations with Cuba, is that their lives, their standard of living would improve overnight. And clearly that's not happened either. I mean, you can understand it, but it is illogical. So that. The second question was, how has it affected U.S. relations in the rest of Latin America? I mean, everybody in Latin America saw the U.S. refusal to have diplomatic relations with Cuba as an impediment. It's something they didn't like. But at the end of the day, what's most important to Argentines is Argentina, not Cuba. What's most important to Peruvians is Peru, not Cuba. I mean, it's something they didn't like, but at the end, if you think about it, I mean, France cares about France, Italy cares about Italy. The same is true of Latin American countries. Here's a fellow Latin American country that we don't like how you're doing it, but now let's get down to talking to you about what the issues are between the United States and Peru, or the United States and Mexico, or the United States and Guatemala. Yes, ma'am.
First, thank you for coming to Juneau and sharing your experiences with us. You mentioned that health care is provided, health care is free. I'm wondering about the health, how healthy people are. You showed the black smoke being spewed. We know they don't have access to a lot of good quality food. Thinking about food, water, clean air, getting out and getting exercise. What's their level of health care and quality of life, say, compared to us in the States?
In public health terms, the level of their health care is great. Okay, so their life expectancy is almost the same as the life expectancy in the United States. Their infant mortality rate is lower than the infant mortality rate in the United States. Almost everybody, as far as I know, has access to clean water, has access to a doctor, in part because doctors get assigned, right, to the small village. So they're not all in Havana. I mean, they're all over the country. Having said that, I mean, and now I'm going to talk anecdotes, not data, because I don't have the data, is that if you have a particular disease, I think you probably can get better treatment for cancer at MD Anderson in Houston, right, than you can in Cuba or at the Mayo Clinic, or you know. But overall, healthcare is good. So one of my friends, an American who's married to a Cuban and lives in Havana 6 months of the year, and he says it's so strange. He says, because their apartment building has a doctor. And he says, so everybody in the apartment building, when they get a cough or you stub your toe, you go see the doctor, right? In economic terms, I mean, your health insurance company would hate that, right? That rather than going to the pharmacy and buying a cough drop, you go see a doctor, right? And for the American who's there, I mean, it's very strange to see, to experience. But on the other hand, everybody has got access to medical care. And you see that with increased life expectancy. Yes, sir.
Thank you again for coming. A couple of questions. I'm curious whether the economic collapse in Venezuela has put additional strain on the Cuban economy. And second, I'm also curious whether the Russian government supports economically Cuba like the Soviets did back in the 60s, 70s, and on?
In broad strokes, the Cuban economy was too dependent on the United States prior to 1959, then too dependent on the Soviet Union. Soviet Union provided huge subsidies to Cuba. And for Cubans, those are actually sort of the golden years under communism. They lived really well until the collapse of the Soviet Union. They went through 10 really miserable years in the 1990s, which the term they use in Spanish translates into English as a special period in time of peace. And what that means is they have rationing and restrictions in peacetime like we had during the Second World War, except worse. Then they became overly dependent on Venezuela. So Venezuela at one point was providing Cuba 123,000 barrels of oil a day, essentially for free, and 1/4 of which Cuba sold on the open market before the oil reached Cuba. So it wasn't like they were using it to fill up cars and trucks, but they were selling it on the spot market. It's down now. I'm not sure the exact, there are people who claim to know, but it's somewhere around 90,000 barrels of oil a day. And it's such a reduction that when I was in Havana in early July, they had rolling blackouts in the neighborhoods. So it's because they're not producing enough electricity. So they in order to deal with the more demand than they can produce electricity, they just simply turn off a whole neighborhood for a few hours. And people are concerned. They see that as getting worse. Here's the other sort of oddity to keep in mind, and Cuba's full of oddities, is because tourism is up. Everybody wants to go to Cuba before it changes, right? I can't tell you how many times I've had that conversation. Tourists use more electricity than Cubans do, right? Tourists want to have air conditioning in the hotel room. Tourists, want the pool to be circulating the water, right? So the more tourists they have, the greater the demand for electricity. And in fact, they have not added to generating capacity since 1959. So they've got a cap on the amount of electricity they can produce with an increasing demand for electricity caused primarily by foreign tourists. And so and the fuel coming from Venezuela is being reduced. So you add that together and they've got some difficulties. That's a great question.
Just a quick question. So prescriptive, both for Venezuela and for Cuba. Any suggestions? Maybe it's a little above your pay grade, but. Oh, no.
Now that I'm retired, I've got loads of suggestions. Just nobody listens to them anymore. But it's pretty straightforward. What needs to happen in Venezuela is the government if you think of Venezuela as the radiator in your car and the escape valve isn't working, right? You need to get that escape valve working. And that means that the government needs to meet with the opposition. They need to sit down and talk seriously. They need to ideally let the recall referendum proceed so you let some of that steam out of the system. And most importantly is they got to open their economy up. They've got to open the economy. They've got to, float their currency. They've got to allow people. There are price controls in Venezuela that on almost everything in the market basket, that the government's. We have a market basket in the United States that. When they talk, Bureau of Labor Statistics talks about what inflation is, it's based on the market basket of stuff that an average person consumes. There are price controls on everything in the market basket in Venezuela. Toothpaste, sugar, coffee, pasta, chicken, you name it. So if you've got a set price for how much you can sell the chicken for at the supermarket, but inflation is running at, I think, 150% this year, it means that within a matter of days, what you can charge for the chicken is less than the cost of feeding, raising, slaughtering, and transporting the chicken. And farmers, wherever they are, aren't going to sell their product for less than the cost of production. That's fairly obvious. So there are huge shortages in Venezuela. So they need to remove price controls. They need to remove price controls. They need to allow more imports. They need to allow Venezuelans to cross the border into Colombia and buy products in Colombia and bring it back. And we can go on. For Cuba, one of the interesting things that's happened is that I think that part of the rapprochement between Cuba and the United States, from the Cuban perspective, is essentially Cuba diversifying its strategic options, right? So if you think about it, is Cuba thinking, wait a minute, we're overly dependent on Venezuela, we need to diversify, and one way we're going to diversify is by improving relations with the United States. And they did it without telling the Venezuelans, by the way, and I think gave Nicolas Maduro quite a surprise. What they need to do is, look, in the U.S., there's a negative list of businesses you cannot go into, right? I mean, you can't be a bank robber, right? You can only be a doctor if you've got a medical degree. In Cuba, there's a positive list. You cannot do this job unless it is on the list. They need to flip that around. They need to let more people go into business so that you can be a lawyer in Cuba, you just can't be a lawyer for yourself. You're going to be a lawyer for the state. You can be a doctor in Cuba, but you can't be a doctor for yourself. You can only be a doctor for the state. The woman who owns the restaurant can only have one restaurant. She can't have a second, third, or fourth restaurant. The way that, I live in Atlanta, and there must be 5 or 6 different restaurant groups who have multiple restaurants. You can't do that. The venue where the restaurant is has to be your family home. You can't go rent a place and open a restaurant there. You can rent rooms, but you can't build a hotel and have a hotel, or you can't go build a place with rooms to rent. That's the sort of stuff they need to release. They need to allow farmers to export. They need to allow farmers to import. They need to allow Home Depots and whatever the Cuban version of Home Depot or Lowe's would be, to allow wholesalers in the country. All that sort of connective tissue that makes an economy work does not exist in Cuba, and they need to find a way to do that without it leading to abject corruption, without allowing what happened in the Soviet Union, which is where the friends of the rulers bought previously state-owned companies at fire sale prices. They need to figure out a way to do that, to move forward, to make the economy grow, to give people hope, to get young Cubans to stay in Cuba, right? To make them want to stay in Cuba. And that's what they need to do. And there's a ton of detail that goes behind that, but nobody's listening to me. Yes, sir.
Sort of a corollary to this is, along with all the subsidies and other types of funds that come in, does Cuba run a foreign debt also? And if so, roughly how large is it?
They run a foreign debt. I don't know exactly.
Sorry, and will it be callable, or is it something that?
No. So one of the things they're very proud of, this is one of these things that I just find makes you want to scratch your head. The Russians just forgave some huge amount of billions of dollars of Soviet debt that the Cubans owed Russia as a successor state to the Soviet Union. The Cuban Foreign Ministry puts out a press release and says, what a great success that is for the revolution. France, Spain, European countries periodically will forgive the Cuban debt. I mean, my view of it is it's quite clear they don't have any intention of ever repaying any debt. And so I don't know why the French and the Spanish and the Japanese continue to lend them new money, because it's never going to be repaid. The Brazilians, I mean, have just built a new harbor out that's west of Havana, and deeper, better harbor, like you would like to have, port facilities. With the Brazilian Development Bank paid Brazilian companies to dredge and construct and build docks and all the stuff that ports require. I would be surprised if the government of Cuba ever repays the Brazilian Development Bank for that. It's just not going to happen. The total number, I don't know. That's a great question. I bet you there are people who can figure it out, and we'll let you know. More questions? Yes, sir. We've got 4 minutes.
I had a quick one.
Sure.
Is there any, this might be a silly question, but is there any tax system? I was wondering about those entrepreneurs. Are they required to pay any money to the government, or?
Yeah, they're 20 years ago, there were no taxes in Cuba. Okay, so now there actually are taxes for the people who are self-employed. They have to pay into the Social Security system, which includes hospitalization. They have to pay for their employees, because they have a lot of employees, right? If you run a restaurant, you've got employees. They have to pay import duties over anything they import, which is mainly coming in via suitcases. And there is an income tax that they have to pay. People who rent rooms in their homes have to, get the license to rent the rooms. They have to pay a fee per month to the government for each room that they're renting. They have to pay a percentage of what they bring in. I mean, so yeah, there are taxes in Cuba. Are those taxes unfair? I'm sure the people who are paying think they are. Don't you think your taxes are unfair? Most people do.
And relative to that, do those entrepreneurs still prefer that, or do they come out ahead?
Oh, they are so glad to do it.
They are, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, let me go back again. The average salary is $23 a month. The average salary is $23 a month. So if you can have foreign tourists who are paying you in hard currency, not in the local Cuban currency, you come out ahead. You come out ahead. Now, who's not paying tax? I mean, there's a load of people who are getting tips, and I don't think they're paying, you go to the tourist hotels, people leave tips, and by the way, they all say Americans are better tippers than the Europeans. They divide it up, they claim, among all the employees of the hotels, so the people working in the kitchen and the people who don't actually have contact with the tourists get a certain percentage of it as well. A woman I talked to says she gets about $70 a month in her share of the tips. So yeah, they come out ahead. And I'd guarantee you she's not paying any tax on that. I guarantee you those two gentlemen who are giving lectures in the slide, they're not paying any income tax on that. I'd be real surprised if they were. So yeah, there are taxes. They don't have an IRS that's as efficient as ours is. But people are paying taxes, but they're willing to do it because they're still coming out way, way, way ahead. And yes, sir, you get the last question.
Yes, thank you. We tend to look at the U.S. embargo, I think, most of us, as something that just affects American business. But could you elaborate on the ways in which the embargo has extranational effects and affects businesses other than just the U.S.?
Yeah, okay. So the U.S. embargo, it's essentially what it does is it adds a huge compliance cost, so that if there's a European bank and you've got Cuban money running through it, it makes them hesitant to handle that money. If a foreign ship goes to Cuba and delivers a cargo in Cuba, it can't go to the United States for another 6 months. I mean, so it's called extraterritoriality. So the embargo has all these extraterritorial impacts on it. any foreign company that is trafficking in property that was confiscated from an American citizen, they lose their visas. So, I mean, I had to call some Canadians and tell them that they were losing their, this was back in the late 90s, that they were losing their US visas. They couldn't come to the United States because the company was actually had a nickel mine on land that had been confiscated from American citizens. I mean, so there, although, you know, the punishment is you can't go to Disneyland. I mean, how bad is that? But that's the punishment. I'm going to end now because my time is up and our producer has given me the thumbs up. I want to thank you all. It's been a real pleasure talking to you, and I'll be delighted to talk to you after. Thank you very much.
That was Ambassador Charles Shapiro in this Juneau World Affairs Council presentation, produced in collaboration with 360 North. It was recorded September 28, 2016 at 360 in Juneau, with support from Alaska Airlines, Alaska Electric Light and Power Company, Alaska Power and Telephone, Kerr Alaska Incorporated, GCI, Hecla Greens Creek Mining Company, Haight and Associates, the Prospector Hotel, Sea Alaska, and Wastman and Associates Incorporated.